Hi, Colleen. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. Well, we're kind of see you all. There's Marilyn. Okay. All right. Okay, let's go ahead and begin then. So we'll start as usual with just a few prayers. Let me get those on the screen. Actually, don't think I have the right file pulled up, but I just have to. Whoops. Okay, that'll work. All right, so let's do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha together once. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Let's do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then Refuge in Bodhicitta, first time in English, and then the twice more in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chunyen Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shok. Okay, let's do a short meditation now. As usual, we'll just spend the first few minutes in silent meditation on the breath in order to focus the mind, and then I'll come in a few minutes and lead you in setting motivation for tonight. So we'll begin the meditation now. So we've been working with these teachings in the Lojong tradition, mind training. And as we've talked about previously, the main targets are these twin demons, these two mindsets that are problematic for us. And when they arise together as twin demons, they become particularly problematic. As we've been going through and examining all the various experiences that we have that are the ripening of our own past karma, we can see how all of those actions arise when we are first clinging to this strong sense of an I that is existing independently, intrinsically, this first demon of self grasping. But then, moreover, we cherish that I, we hold that I to be very dear. We become focused on the welfare of that I, often to the exclusion and perhaps even the detriment of others. And this is how we engage in negative karma, is both of these operating in tandem to take us down that pathway of creating only more suffering for ourselves, and in the process, frequently creating suffering for others, but always neglecting the welfare of others. Whenever we're focused on ourselves to the exclusion of others, then we can't attend to their needs. We can't be responsive to their suffering. So let's set our motivation of bodhicitta. Again, the conventional bodhicitta is the direct antidote to this mind of self-centeredness. It's a mind where we are setting our needs aside. We're rededicating ourselves every time that we generate this mind to the path of awakening for the benefit of others, using this life to achieve our greatest potential so we can then help others to do the same. And we can't have this mind of self-cherishing operative when bodhicitta is present, because it's a mind that is focused on the welfare of others. We're included in that. Definitely our welfare will be met, but we're secondary. Our own enlightenment is the way that we accomplish the means of achieving the benefit of all beings, the welfare of all beings. But it is not the main objective. When we set our sights on bodhicitta, we are thinking solely about the welfare of all beings. As we look at the world that we're in and we see how much suffering there is, we see the pain and difficulty that beings are in due to their own ignorance, due to their own delusions and their own karma. It breaks our heart, and we decide that we have to do something about this, and therefore we will become a Buddha in order to benefit those beings. We will achieve our own greatest potential so we can help them to do the same. And generating this mind, we then can at least be free of that second demon, the demon of self-centeredness, self-cherishing. Then eventually we can do the deeper work to remove the self-grasping. And then we can help all beings to do this same work. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. Okay, so last week we did have that little exercise I shared with you that Rinpoche gave about the wheel of sharp weapons while driving. I hope some of you were able to practice that if you did have some kind of unfortunate things happening on the road. Hopefully not too unfortunate, accidents or what have you, but there's just the everyday bothers. I did find myself, I don't know if you all saw this in Missoula or wherever you're located, but after the pandemic, people seem to be a lot more aggressive in their driving. I don't know. Maybe it's just that I wasn't driving as much that I didn't kind of notice it until I was back on the road a bit more. But it just seems like everyone sort of, was all that pent up energy, and they're all of a sudden, back on the road with like this strong intent to get wherever they needed to go and to hell with everybody else. But when you see it in others, of course, and you can see it in yourself, and that's the only way to use kind of seeing it in others, is to generate more compassion and concern for others. But it's something that we can definitely have a heightened awareness of once we kind of see that other people are being driven by that so much around us when they're driving that way, we go, oh, this is just simply a reflection of my own state of mind that got me into the karma of experiencing that, being on the receiving end of that, the way that I've driven in the past without regard to other people and what have you. So any comments on that? Or again, I suggested that you could certainly do that sort of similar exercise with regard to anything else you're experiencing. And even if you wanted to write your own little verse, I don't know if anybody wrote a verse on the basis of some sort of suffering. Oh, Marilyn did. Oh, wonderful. Would you like to share it? That would be great. There you go.
Well, if I understood what I'm supposed to be doing.
Sure.
So always in my practice of mind training, for
Mhm.
some reason it seems like my thoughts, if I'm thinking about what I'm going to do for the day, they have a tendency to go straight to the negative for some reason. And I'm going and I watch and I go, why does it go straight to the negative? But so
Mhm.
I worked with verse 11 out
Mhm.
of all of our verses. And I made it so that I can practice this when I watch this happen.
Mhm.
Whenever my thoughts turn to worry, anger, fear, it is definitely the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against me for having disturbed the mental continuum of others. Now I should willingly take upon myself all their dukkha without exception. And I'm going to try to memorize that and
Oh,
just
good.
see what
Good.
was that. Is that kind of what you were suggesting?
Yeah, yeah, no, it certainly, yeah. If you find a particular verse that resonates for you, to work with that one. The other idea that again I was throwing out there was if people even wanted to write their own verse, that would be like a, whenever my mother annoys me here while I'm taking care of her, which I love my mother dearly, but it is a practice of patience. So, I mean, and then of course the second line would be the same. It's the sharp weapons, the wheel of sharp weapons returning to harm me of bad actions. Writing harm turning against us. That's the phrase. And then, of course, I would say, well, and it's because of the ways that I've lacked patience and been sharp with other people. And then, whatever. And from now on, I should be tolerant of my mother's. I don't know. Anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah, no, it's a good, I think it's a good way to train your mind is you can recognize what's the cause here, so don't
Yeah.
perpetuate it.
Right,
So
exactly.
thank
Say,
you.
oh, anytime that something's happening to us that kind of gets our goat, well, then it's gotten your goat because you created it. This is your stuff. So own it, take responsibility for it, and then see what you would do differently.
Yeah.
So that's an invitation that stands for this. We're going to probably conclude this section of these types of verses tonight, but certainly if this is something you kind of feel you want to be creative about, then just put together your own little verse that kind of works with something that you're experiencing frequently, especially these days, and that way you have something you can work with. It may already be within the verses, such as what the one that Marilyn mentioned that is really pertinent to what's going on for her. So, and that's fine if you find one of these that really is juicy and seems to be an important one to remember right now, then work with that. But if there's something else that you feel like you're going through, again, because of all of these karmas are generally not always in terms of every single verse, but they're generally something that is very similar to what we've done in the past. So we can at least make that assumption. We can say, okay, if people are talking about me behind my back, well, then that means that I must have gossiped about other people and said negative things about them to others. So this is something I want to be really meticulous in trying to avoid, and having a little verse to go with it can just give you the reinforcement to do that work. But that's great. Yeah. Anyone else want to share anything on that? Or if you did put together a verse, you're again more than welcome. I'll invite that again at later point in the course.
Two
Maybe.
different things, Don.
Sure, Bill.
One, I've definitely focused a lot. I mean, I've heard Rinpoche's, teaching on driving
Mhm.
for a long time, and it's a really big problem for me.
Mhm.
And I felt like for one of the first times ever, I was like actually able to practice that recently and just have
Oh,
been really concentrating on it. The second thing is, and this is just an aside, and maybe something we can talk about another time, but we've been doing some meditations just using the 37 practices
mhm,
as glance meditations. And I think it's really interesting how a lot of the negative situations are similar between the two texts, whereas and one kind of focuses on the karmic causes of those, where the other one kind of focuses on how you should respond.
mhm.
Um, and anyway, Melanie and I were doing a meditation last night together, and it was just really interesting to just kind of like compare and contrast the two
Yeah.
texts and how they talk about the same kind of situation arising in your life. So I just thought I'd
Yeah.
mention that.
No, I mean, you could certainly consider Tokme Sangpo's text to be in the mind training tradition. It goes into, again, more of the Lam Rim teachings as well, kind of covers everything in the Lam Rim pretty much. But yeah, it definitely is in the same vein. It's not part of the mind training collection. That is that larger volume of things that were kind of out of the Tibetan and Indian traditions that were kind of put together into that. But it's nonetheless, I mean, just in the same way that Shantideva's text is also very much about mind training. I mean, a lot of them are in the same category, even though they might not be technically in that. But yeah, it's a great text. Yeah, good. All right, thanks, Bill, for sharing. Oh, by the way, on driving, I might mention that when I first started paying attention to my driving, of course, I didn't have the wheel sharp. I guess I may have had the wheel sharp weapons teachings back then because I first received teachings, I think, in 96 or 97. I can't remember the date when it was one of those summers. But I was in the Bay Area. And of course, I did have a car, even though I lived in San Francisco for many years in San Francisco. I felt I didn't need a car, but oh man, I started noticing how bad a driver I was in terms of getting wrapped up in all this stuff and people cutting you off and the ease with which you could flip somebody off or do worse. So I started noticing it, and that's the big thing is just like even if you notice it after the fact, you already have gotten upset and angry and honked your horn or whatever, and then you go, I just did it again. That's great. That's more than what we were doing before. We're just going about honking at everybody and not even caring. And so what will happen is you're able to pull it in further or closer and closer to when you actually get annoyed. Of course, I don't know. I didn't drive in Italy for a number of years, so I think I lost some of my training when I went back to the States after the master's program, and so I had to learn things over again. But if you're out there and you just at least even notice that you've just done something, congratulate yourself. Don't beat yourself up. That's the whole message of what I'm trying to get across right now is wherever we can catch ourselves in regard to these sorts of trainings, that's great. Even if it's after the fact and you go, I just stepped in it again. Well, okay. You at least recognize that you stepped in it. Before you wouldn't even recognize it. You just go about your business and keep, saying and doing the same things over and over again. So that's how we begin to break patterns is first by noticing that we're doing it. And then we begin to move it in and try to catch it. Maybe you catch it when you're already 3/4 of the way through. Well, that's great. And then maybe you're half the way through, and then you're a quarter of the way through, and then you get it just before you open your mouth or honk the horn or whatever. So this is how we change our minds, is in a very gradual way. We can't just flip a switch and get these teachings and then suddenly we're perfectly, practicing our mind training every time we get behind the wheel of a car or anytime that we're talking to other people or whatever. It's going to be a learning curve. And it won't be like an exact, thing where you just go straight on up and achieve it. It'll be all over the place. And you'll find yourself sometimes getting disappointed that you haven't done as well as it seemed like you were doing before. But you've got different situations every time. You have different terms in terms of where you're at, what's been going on for you in your day, the people that you're interacting with. Everything is changing all the time. So don't beat yourself up. Don't use these teachings as a tool to make you feel horrible about yourself. And we're all just taking our time to adapt these teachings as best as we can and just getting up and doing them again, day by day by day. And the change comes over time. So, All right, let's go back into the teachings. So what I wanted to do to get things started was to go to the slides and just start there, because I mentioned that I find these little passages that are in some of the texts that I think are really quite nice. This is from Venerable Chodron's Good Karma. Again, it's not necessarily in relation to the verses that we're currently on, but it was in this section where we're looking at all of these. And she says, each verse in the Wheel of Sharp Weapons gives us clues about the specific karma causing different situations. We can then think, I will reflect on my life and acknowledge when I've done that type of action. I have probably done that action in previous lives as well. Now I regret such harmful behavior, and I want to make preparations by studying and practicing thought training, and like prepare ourselves so that when we meet it again, we're going to study and practice thought training, so that when similar situations arise in the future, I will not act according to the same dysfunctional habitual behavior. Instead, I will know how to see the situation in a different light and transform it into the path. So this is her way of framing what we're doing, which fits very neatly into what I was just talking about. That we use these teachings to encourage us to have the thought process that we can adapt to particular situations when we meet them. And then we just keep doing it, and the mind changes over time. So let's go on to the verse that we left off with last time. Again, this was one that is actually on the previous week's homework. And you can probably start with this one when we do the discussion tonight. Verse 39, whenever, whatever we do, attachment and hatred arise in us. So if we see like there's this profusion of the delusions, especially attachment and hatred, which are again these two driving forces: attachment to the pleasant things that we experience, and hatred or anger towards the unpleasant things. So when we have like these poles of experience from what is pleasant to what is unpleasant, if we see that our attachment and anger just keep arising, it's the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having hardened our intractable and negative continuum, our kind of stubborn, belligerent mind. Now we should rid ourselves completely of this rigidity. Of course, that means we have to work with the delusions. We have to work with the afflictions. So let's look at what Geshe Champa Gyatso says in regard to this. There's the commentary. Okay, so this was on page 16. The verse started on the bottom of 15. He just has a short commentary on this. He says, whenever, due to our continuum, having come under the control of the afflictions, again, such as hatred, attachment, and so on, whatever we do, we are unable to put a stop to the negative minds of attachment to our own side, hatred for other side, and so forth, all the various delusions that can arise. It appears to be retribution for having in the past until now hardened out of selfishness our continuum made intractable by self-cherishing. Therefore, from now on, we should rid ourselves completely of the enemy, self-cherishing, that acts to harden our continuum. That is, we should eradicate it from the root. So this idea of this kind of obstinate mind of self-cherishing is underneath all of these. If we look at it again from the point of view of what's happening, as I said, when we have something pleasant that arises in our field of experience, the mind of attachment generally arises, which is thinking solely about our relationship to that object of pleasure. And we want to get it for ourselves. And of course, if we run into conflict with other people, if it's like the last piece of a particular dessert that we like that's at the store or at the bakery, and we really want that tonight. That's our mind of self-cherishing. It's thinking about ourselves. It's a very weak example in some ways, but nonetheless, this is what our mind does frequently, right? Thinks about, I want that for me. And then we get there and there's somebody else who's coming at the same time as us, and maybe we speed up a little bit thinking, oh, they're the ones that are going to take that last piece that's over there. And we get it for ourselves, and we're so happy that we've taken that. And our self-cherishing mind is delighted because we've just done exactly what it wants us to do, right? To think about ourselves and to not think about others at that time. And maybe that person was coming for that same dessert, and now they're all disappointed. Well, it would have been very easy for us, if we weren't under the control of self-cherishing, to say, oh, were you coming here for this dessert? Here, you go ahead and take it. I don't need it tonight. Right? Not a big deal, right? We do this all the time with various things. Maybe it's not exactly that example, but we tend to think about ourselves. And in the process, we don't think about others' needs, what they might like, what they would bring them happiness. This is a very, again, kind of mundane example, but this is this type of mindset that we fall into. That's when our attachment that is after what is pleasurable arises. And then, of course, we have the anger and aversion towards what is unpleasant, where we can't think about, the other person, maybe what their needs are or whatever. We just get angry and upset at them. Again, this is these habitual patterns that we fall into. Now, again, all of our Lojong teachings, we can say to some degree, are all about fighting the afflictions, because the afflictions are going to be arising in tandem with both of these demons, these twin demons. Again, self-cherishing at a very subtle level isn't necessarily afflicted. It's not necessarily tainted. We discussed this towards the beginning of this course, the very first session, when we looked at this very subtle level of self-cherishing that the bodhisattvas find to be their big enemy as well, because that's the self-cherishing that drives one to achieve freedom from samsara for themselves alone on the Hinayana, or the fundamental vehicle path. But it's in its grosser form, the self-cherishing causes us to have attachment and hatred and jealousy and greed and all the various things that manifest in our minds that are problematic. So we need to be attentive to its arising and to be kind of vigilant in watching out for these delusions. This is a big part of mind training. We have that one verse that is, let me take it off there for a second. I was going to go to a slide, but there's that one verse from the 8 verses that, again, I introduced the 8 verses to you. Many of you know those teachings from previously having received instruction in them. It's the 3rd verse. It says, whenever a delusion arises in my mind, endangering myself and others, I shall confront and avert it without delay. When we see an affliction or a delusion arising in our mind, and we see this is problematic for ourselves and for others, it's going to cause others pain. It's definitely causing us problems, because it's an obstacle at that time to our well-being. It's disturbing our own minds. Well, then I'm going to confront and avert it without delay. And that's a real high level of practice where you can, like, immediately you see it arising in your mind and go, I have to just nip it in the bud, get it out of here. It's the enemy. It's the problem. Let's look at some slides that I have that kind of share things along this line from some of the commentaries that we're working with. When, despite all your efforts to conquer the afflictions, your mind remains disturbed by lust and hatred, it is the result of not having applied the antidote in the past and of allowing the afflictions to stubbornly remain in your mind. This is kind of another form of karma ripening that is similar to the cause, but in terms of our behavior. Why do we have a preponderance of lust and hatred and various afflictions? Because we haven't tamed our minds in the past. So again, the instruction in this section is to do that now. Don't allow the afflictions to remain in your mind. Don't even allow them to arise in the mind. Thinking that way, Geshe Sopa says, you should resolve that from now on, this kind of obduracy should be totally uprooted from your mind. This obstinate, obdurate, kind of persistence of the afflictions needs to be gotten rid of. We need to see how stubbornly they are rooted in our minds and uproot them once and for all. There's a verse from Shantideva's text. I was just talking about Shantideva's text earlier in chapter 4. Chapter 4 is the chapter on conscientiousness, I think. We're going to talk about conscientiousness a little later tonight. He says in that, I would rather be burned and killed and even have my head cut off than to ever bow down to the enemy that is the afflictions in any way. That's like pretty strong practice, right? That I would let somebody kill me, cut my head off, do whatever, rather than have an affliction like anger arise towards that being who is doing that or who's threatening me or whatever the case might be. I mean, that's pretty heavy. That's pretty, you might look at it and say that's impossible. It isn't impossible. Shantideva, is attesting to his own level of practice through that. And many of our gurus can also, be an example of how to practice that type of patience and perseverance and what have you. Then I wanted to share a little bit from Geshe Sopa in his Lam Rim commentary, the great Lam Rim commentary and volume 2 that has to do with the afflictions and karma and what have you. This is from the Kadampa Geshe Ben Kongyal. He was one of these great masters in that lineage of Lojong mind training that, again, Lama Atisha brought to Tibet about 1,000 years ago. He said, standing at the door of the afflictions, holding the spear of the antidotes. Other than that, I have no other job. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at our Buddhist job, if you will. What is our job as Buddhists? To stand at the door of the afflictions, where the afflictions are going to come in, and we're holding the spear of the antidotes. We're like ready to like, it's a lot of these weaponry analogies. We're ready to like pierce it with this spear. That's our job. So he continues. He had some really nice advice in this section, so I'm just sharing it. All you need to do is guard the door against the afflictions. Maybe a better way to put it is everything you need to do is to guard the door against the afflictions, your mind, so that the afflictions don't rise. Your job is to use your wisdom to watch the door of the mind and ask, what is it doing? What is it planning to do? What is coming in? How is it reacting? If you are diligent in this, you will be successful. If this is how we are continually looking at our minds, watching our minds, to train our minds to know when these afflictions are arising and to know how to avert them, confront and avert them without delay. Remember Geshe Langri Tampa's 8 verses. That's what we need to do. That's the work. That's the job. And as you gain control over these inner enemies, you will find that you are naturally controlling the outer enemies, the sufferings you experience in psychic existence, because they are the results of the inner enemies, the obscuring afflictions. So this is like, could be commentary on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, right? This is what we're looking at as we work with gaining control over the inner enemies, over the things that we're trying to master and to reduce in our own minds. Then the outer enemies will stop appearing. The outer sufferings won't be there. Because that's how karma works. If we change what we're doing with our minds and our behavior on the basis of that, we stop creating the causes for these results. That's why they say for high-level bodhisattvas, they relish somebody who pushes their buttons, because it gives them an opportunity to practice and deepen their patience and their loving kindness and what have you. For us, we're like, thank you very much. I'll avoid that person. I know that they push my buttons and I don't want anything to do with them. And are times when that's our first line of defense, is to say, okay, I need to gather my strength so that when I am with that person, I can actually use my mind training techniques. I can use my understanding of the afflictions and my ability to combat them to practice. And until we are there, it's probably best to have some distance between ourselves and difficult, challenging situations. But then we get to a point where, okay, we've thought about it enough, we've worked on these teachings enough, we've gained an understanding of the afflictions enough. I want to actually test my mind and see what happens when I'm in those situations. Then we relish those situations and we look forward to them. And you can get to a point, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in his book, Transforming Problems into Happiness, this is, again, one of them. I think it was on your book list from the beginning. He says that you will learn to like problems in the same way that you like ice cream or music or whatever it is that is kind of your go-to thing that you like, that brings you delight. You're just looking forward to having that. Well, you can actually have that attitude towards problems too. It sounds strange, sounds weird right now, but you can get to that place through training the mind. Because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where we actually know whether our mind training has worked, is if we're able to be in those situations and actually have some control, be able to use the spear of the antidotes to confront and avert all of these unhealthy states of mind. So this is kind of nice. This was kind of a direct movement from what we talked about before we began tonight, and just looking at anger and the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, other things, and see that, again, this is the main part of the work. This is a really important verse. This is one you can certainly reflect on a lot, to know that we have to start doing the work, rolling up our sleeves and fighting these afflictions, or else we're going to continue to see these sufferings arising in our experience. Again, it's kind of weird, because we say in some way we don't want those sufferings to arise, but when you really get into the practice, you do want them to arise, because they are tests for you. But again, that doesn't mean that you provoke somebody. Don't go like making people behave in ways that they don't want to behave in so that you have a chance to practice. That's really selfish. You don't want them to kind of get annoyed by the things you're doing so you can practice Lojong. I mean, that's not the way we wanted to go about it. Use the situations that arise naturally, that are a ripening of your past karma. Somebody or something in your life that triggers the afflictions generally for you, and say, I'm going to do something different this time. I'm going to work on it. And again, you do the best that you can. And then, be content with that and recognize that you'll do better the next time because you've done the work each time. Let's go forward, or else we're going to spend too much time on this, but this is a really important verse, 39. Let's go to 40. Whatever we practice, we do not reach our objective. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having assimilated an inferior view. Now, whatever we do should be done for others' welfare. We're going to look at a couple of verses here in this middle section, going towards the end of this collection of verses that are in this format, that are all about kind of us not getting what we want in terms of especially our spiritual objectives and spiritual practice. Though, of course, we can apply the same in regard to any of our more worldly things. But Geshe-la comments on it mostly in regard to our spiritual practice. He says, whatever practice we do, such as meditating on the generation and completion stages, these are the 2 stages of highest yoga tantra, or accomplishing the Lam Rim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, which we all know of through our prior study. Whenever we do that, we do not reach our objective. That is, we never get to the essential point. We never kind of get to a place where we go, I got it. I'm able to focus on the main point of that meditation or that visualization or whatever. It is because in this life and in previous rebirths, we assimilated an inferior view. With respect to views in general, while there are in fact many views that are supramundane and mundane, the view in this context is the inferior view that neglects others through viewing oneself as dear. In other words, self-cherishing, that good old demon that we've been working on as the main culprit in this entire section. Think this is the bad actions turning against me of assimilating the view that cherishes myself. Then meditate on taking and giving. Again, that's a key part of all of these verses, to do Tonglen with others who are having the same thing. If we're having difficulty with achieving our practice, well, there are many people who are in the same boat as you. Bring their suffering that they're experiencing through that onto your own self-cherishing mind. Give them all of your happiness and merit so they can be free of those obstacles and achieve great realizations and so on. And it says, from now on, whatever virtuous deeds we do, we must do them solely for others' welfare, utterly unpolluted by the entanglement of selfishness. So again, this is always kind of the main culprit that we're pointing at in regard to this section, is that we must have been under the control of this inferior view that is not living up to our real potential, that is not actually acknowledging that our happiness comes from cherishing others, not from cherishing ourselves. It's an inferior view because it doesn't lead to any real happiness. It seems like it in the moment, again, going back to that example of going after that dessert or delicious thing at the bakery that you want and there's one remaining. It seems like if you get that and get it for yourself, that's going to give you happiness. Well, it gives you the pleasure of eating it, but it only increased your attachment. It only made you blind to the other people who might be interested in getting that as well. So again, it's a mundane example, but it works in terms of pointing out to us how pervasive this mind of self-cherishing is. And it is, again, this kind of pernicious or inferior view. I think pernicious is the term that Venerable Chodron uses in her commentary. She says, pernicious views are wrong views we held in previous lives or in this life. And she elaborates on this to include more things, such as thinking Dharma practice is unimportant, attaining full awakening is impossible, thinking our actions have no ethical dimension, right? These are all possibilities of inferior thoughts that we might have that could become real obstacles to our doing our practice fully, and thereby we don't have good results in our practice, right? And being self-centered is useful to prevent people from taking advantage of us. This is another thought that we can have in our minds, right? That is all about self-cherishing and self-centeredness, where we see it as a protector to us. Well, if I stay focused on my own welfare, then others won't take advantage of me. Now, the Bodhisattva actually wants to be used by others, wants to be of advantage to others. If they want to take advantage of us, then we see it as a gift, an opportunity to be of benefit to them. Whereas the self-centered mind sees it exactly the opposite way, that we want to be protected from anyone using us in any way, taking advantage of us. She goes on to say, pernicious views also refer to the 8 worldly concerns. These are also mentioned in the next verse, so I'm going to wait and talk about them a little more there. Bad motivations and rebelling against our spiritual mentors' wise instructions, which of course is something we want to avoid at all costs, is to kind of go against the advice given by our precious gurus. They give all the advice to us, whether it be personal or in large groups when we receive teachings, solely for our benefit. So to kind of think that we should do the opposite is turning our back on what they have to share. So that's maybe enough on that one. Let's go on to 41. Whatever virtuous practices we do, our continuum remains unsubdued. So again, this is another one about our practice. And in this case, we don't see the sort of effects happening in terms of things don't seem to stick and continue to be carrying forward into our life. Our continuum remains unsubdued. Our mind is not being tamed. Well, it's the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. Why? For having given priority to the grandeur of this life. Now we should concentrate on the desire for liberation. So one of the main ways that we see this kind of attachment to the grandeur of this life is what are, again, called the 8 worldly dharmas, 8 worldly concerns. I think I've touched on these briefly before, but I'll just go through them with a little more detail. These are 4 pairs. The first one is being attached to having material gain. We like things coming in. We like more money from people, more gifts, more belongings, more whatever. And we don't like loss. We don't like to lose things or to have things slip away from us and not be able to get them. That's in terms of material things. Then we have the second pair, which is mostly around like comfort and pleasure, where we really like pleasurable, comfortable situations. Venerable Rabina told me once that this is the one that she gets most trapped up in, is wanting things our way, wanting it to be comfortable. Always wanting the temperature to be right, always wanting things to be exactly the way we like them to be. This is a pervasive mind that we have frequently, right? Even in the course of sitting through a teaching for an hour and a half here, look at how many times we just change our physical position to get into something that's a little more comfortable. That's why oftentimes when we do meditation, it's good to work with the discomfort for a bit. Don't hurt your body. If you've got a leg or a knee or something that is really problematic, don't torture yourself, but just see what the mind is like when it's constantly trying to attend to wanting to be comfortable. These are just thoughts. Again, I'm not discounting those situations where you do have something physically going on that disallows you from being in a position, a meditative position, or what have you for a long period of time. Be attentive to that, but just notice the frequency with which we want to be comfortable. And we avoid discomfort like the plague, right? I don't want to be in that situation. I don't want to go there. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. All right, the third pair have more to do with kind of the what we receive from others, that the strokes, the praise, the people telling good things about us, and then of course avoiding the blame, the criticism, anything like that. And then the fourth one is a more broader thing about our reputation, always wanting to have a good reputation. People think well of us in general in society or whatever circle of people we're involved in, work, what have you. And then also to avoid ill repute, people thinking poorly of us. These are worldly concerns. I'm not saying that these things in and of themselves are problems. It's the attachment we have to those. We need things to be comfortable. We need things to be where we're being praised and being talked about, rather than getting negative things said about us and being criticized. All of these things we get quite attached to. In and of themselves, they're just experiences. And so the problem is, how is our mind relating to those? So we have patterns of attachment. And then, of course, when attachment doesn't get what it wants, the other four that are problematic, then we have an aversion to those things. They're all rooted in a sense of attachment in terms of us wanting our worldly existence to have certain features. And whenever they're outside of the range of what we want, then we get really bent out of shape. But they're problematic even when we do get what we want because we just get more attached to it. I call this like our Goldilocks syndrome. We all remember Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? You know, she was looking for everything to be just right. You know, she went to the house and, okay, this soup's a little too cold. Oh, this one's too hot. Oh, this one's just right. You know, she did the same thing with the chair and the bed and all these other things, right? You know, we have our inner Goldilocks that is always trying to get everything just right in terms of our daily experience. That's a form of self-cherishing, really. It's like us being attentive to just our own needs. Because what happens if you get like a bunch of people together and, for example, it's the winter and you're at some vacation rental or something, and some people want it really the heat really cranked up, and some people are more comfortable if the heat's a little lower and they put on a little more clothes or whatever, right? We all have different opinions about what is a comfortable temperature to be in. You can end up having like a disastrous weekend with somebody or with a group of people if all they do is fight over what temperature the room should be, right? I mean, again, what is the big deal? You know, so we adjust. You know, so I'm having to do that a bit here. My mom likes a really warm house, and today it was like almost 80 degrees outside. Really strange weather for October. But anyway, I'm like sweating in this house, and I didn't bring that many kind of, you know, I didn't bring shorts or anything like that to wear. I wasn't expecting this kind of weather. But you know, we just try to adjust. You know, what's the big deal? Okay, so a few days I'm not going to be that comfortable. What's the big deal? So anyway, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here in any way. I still have my work to do in regard to a lot of these things. But you know, we just do the best that we can and try to see how much we're attached to these worldly affairs, these worldly things. Again, the verse that we're working with, you know, had that phrase, the grandeur of this life, you know, the enticements, the pleasures of this life. Let's look at what Geshe-la says on this so we can kind of move on. There's a few things I wanted to share after this as well. He says, verse 41, whenever, despite performing many virtuous practices, our continuum remains utterly unsubdued, mundane, ordinary, and not at all special. That is, we fail to acquire virtue. We fail to develop that mind that is more virtuous and has the non-attachment and non-hatred and all of the, you know, opposing states of mind. Think whatever kind of virtuous practices and so forth there were in this life and previous rebirths, by the force of keeping solely the grandeur of this life in my innermost heart, thinking, may I have happiness and pleasure, a good reputation, fame, status, and the like in this life. Due to having thought that way, there did not emerge even slight improvement in my mind. Then meditate on taking and giving, again, because other people are having the same problems. Their minds aren't developing because the patterns in the past were involved in worldly affairs. From now on, without coming under the influence of the grandeur of this life, even slightly, whatever virtue we do should be done with a single pointed concentrated mind, with the sole purpose of attaining non-abiding nirvana. Again, non-abiding nirvana is Buddhahood. Just when we use the phrase just simply nirvana, we're usually referring to the nirvana of those who practice the fundamental vehicle, the hearers and solitary realizers, as they're called, those practitioners that are aiming for self-liberation. Again, they have that subtle form of self-cherishing because they're not going the full distance to non-abiding nirvana. It's non-abiding in that it's not abiding in solitary peace like those beings are, but it's also not abiding in samsara any longer because it's free of samsara. You kind of abide in the world still. You don't abide in some sort of distance from the world. And it says here, non-abiding nirvana, the supreme liberation that is free from the bondage of the bad tendencies of the afflictive obstructions or obscurations and the obscurations to objects of knowledge. These are the two levels of obscurations that need to be removed to achieve Buddhahood or non-abiding nirvana. If you only want to achieve nirvana, self-liberation, then you only need to remove the first, the afflictive obscurations. which are what keep us bound in samsara. But in order to attain Buddhahood, we also have to remove what are called the knowledge obscurations, these very subtle imprints in the mind that cause a distorted appearance of things. So anyway, we're not going to talk about them quite as much in this class. Let's go to the slides. I think I had one other thing, maybe two, to share on this. This is again from Venerable Chodron. I like this comment of hers. So again, I'm sharing things that are worth maybe a little extra discussion. When we are convinced that the glitter of the 8 worldly concerns will not make us happy, because that's the big tool to kind of see that this chase that we're on of trying to get the 4 that are in the column that bring pleasure and avoid the 4 that bring displeasure, it's just a mundane chase that we're never going to find an answer to. It's easier for our minds, she says, to regenerate renunciation of cyclic existence and the determination to be free from it. This is one of the realizations that precedes bodhicitta, is where we renounce samsara by saying, I am sick and tired of it, and I know it doesn't lead anywhere. I'm only going to cycle from life to life and keep experiencing the same garbage over and over again. It's time to be free. It's time to get out of this prison, right? She says such a motivation makes our minds much more peaceful because instead of fretting about irrelevant things, it is focused on something meaningful. This motivation must be cultivated with effort. Again, renunciation is taught as the main teaching to come out of the middle scope, the person of middling capacity in the Lam Rim. In the first scope, we are dealing with being focused on getting a good rebirth. In the second scope, the middle scope, we are looking at being free from samsara, developing renunciation that turns away from cyclic existence. And then, of course, the great scope is where we practice bodhicitta, the 3rd level. Then, if this is how we practice, if somebody criticizes us or blames us, again, that was one of the 8 worldly concerns, right? We don't care much. Why? Because we're focused on liberation. If you are in prison and want to get out, you don't worry about dust in your prison cell. Why? Because you're focused on how to escape, right? A little bit of dust, a little bit of dirt. Who cares? It's the same in our lives, our mundane lives. We're going to experience a difficulty, dirt, dust, what have you. But it doesn't matter because we're focused on getting the hell out of here, right? And moreover, we're focused on achieving non-abiding nirvana, going to the lengths of achieving enlightenment, which takes, again, even greater focus and dedication. Verse 42, whenever, as soon as we sit down, we examine ourselves and develop regret. This is a particular in regard to our spiritual practice where we have some sense of regret. In another text is translated as kind of a despair. We just don't feel like we've done what we needed to do. It's a sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us for unabashedly making new friends and flitting from one lofty person to another. This is one of these you scratch your head and go, how is that type of experience related to this type of cause? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. Now we should be attentive to all in the manner of a friend. One of the ways that we'll see, and it's not going to be set out quite so distinctly in regard to the commentary, is that when we have this mind that is not being sort of faithful or dedicated to people, we often have the same mindset in regard to the activities that we do. What's that phrase that they used to say about a jack of all trades but a master of none? I mean, it's kind of like if you have all these different practices and maybe you get like a number of tantric initiations and you spend a little time doing this and a little time doing that, and then over here, over this and that, you meditate some days on this and then you go on to something else that seems more entertaining. You have a mind that's flittering all over the place, like a butterfly going looking for pollen and the flowers and what have you. It's not going to stay in any one place and actually achieve what's more lasting. So when we get to that place where we're despairing because it doesn't seem like things have hit home or we've developed anything over time, we look back on our spiritual practice. I've been practicing for decades and there's not really any effect. Nothing's really changed. Well, what have you been doing? Have you been flitting around from one thing to another, or have you been really focused and saying, okay, I'm going to work with precious human rebirth until I really get the penny to drop, as Venerable Rabina would say, till I really get it to hit home. And then I'll move on to something else, even though you might find it dry at times, even though you might be kind of tired of meditating on that subject, until it hits home. You're not going to have that kind of success. So this is one way of interpreting this, even though also we might see it that patterns happening in terms of how we deal with people. So let's go down to the commentary at the top of page 17 there. When at the time of practicing meditation, while staying in retreat, for instance, and so forth, we examine our continuum and seeing that it did not strike the essential point even once, you didn't kind of get there and have it really hit home. Develop a regret or again a despair that thinks something similar to it is good to not do any commitments today. So if we get to that place where we just are kind of giving up on our practice, we're not even feeling like there's any use to it. Well, then at this time we have to think, Geshe-la says, this is the bad actions turning against me of in previous rebirths unabashedly, making new friends and flitting from one lofty person to another and the like. And we can interpret this at times as like going to different teachers, and that's what he goes into in this next paragraph. If we are kind of flitting around from one guru to another, well, then obviously we're going to have problems because we might get differing advice. We might have things that we like about one person and not like about the other, and so we don't listen to the advice of that second person. He goes on to say then in that next paragraph, if making new friends is illustrated with respect to a guru, for instance, it is to initially take him as a new friend and request him for Dharma teachings and so forth, but after not much time to act without embarrassment towards him or her, that is to disparage them and the like. To flit from one lofty person to another is, for example, when someone who teaches emptiness, for instance, comes along to develop a liking for them, and then when someone who teaches bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, for instance, comes along to desert the former teacher and develop a liking for this new person. When doing taking and giving, from now on, we should be attentive to everyone as if they were a friend. And I guess what we could say in regard to our practice, if we're going to kind of interpret that to also mean how we've gone about doing our practice, is to see all teachings as personal instruction. This is actually one of the gems of the Lam Rim. You might recall that when you go through the initial part of the Lam Rim, it always talks about the 4 benefits of the Lam Rim. And one of them is that it allows us to see all of the relevant teachings the Buddha gave as personal instructions, instructions for me. Oftentimes we go through the Lam Rim, we go, oh, that's not as important for me to meditate on. We might think that we've gotten it or we have some, it doesn't really pertain, but it all is personal instruction. Lojong, of course, is personal instruction that we need to take to heart. There may be some of these teachings where, again, you go, oh, maybe that's not happening for me right now, but just wait. Life has a tendency to give us things that we need, right? And so there may be a later time in your life, maybe not that long from now, where some of these teachings you have to go back to your wheel of sharp weapons and go, I wonder if that was covered. I wonder if that gives me some clue as to what to do now. So again, don't have a respect for all the teachings, treat all of them with respect, and especially have that also manifest in terms of how we work with our teachers, to respect them all as being, important guides for us. And then, of course, to also respect friends, other people, especially Dharma friends, to not kind of abandon them. We might get really picky with regard to mundane friends, people who are maybe not involved in the Dharma, but even that is not a good pattern to have. See that everyone has something to offer. There may be, again, some people that we mentioned this before, that maybe fall to the wayside because their values and where they're at isn't quite in line with where we're at. And that's okay. But don't lose your respect for them. So Venerable Chodron, again, I liked some of what she said here in regard to this, where she said this boredom, disappointment, and remorse that we are experiencing when we're not seeing the essential point of these meditations and so on are the results of being shamelessly fickle and clamoring for high status. Seeking fame and recognition, we buttered people up in the hope that they would do something for us. So she applies it very much to the words of the verse, which is saying, don't treat our relationships casually. We use some people here to help us, thinking that they're going to, get us places. But as soon as another person could do more for us, we deserted our previous companions and took up with new ones, right? Oh, this person's more valuable than those people. They're inferior compared to what I can get out of this new friend. So then we go off with someone else thinking they're going to do something better for us. Similarly, we might go guru hopping, forming a relationship with one teacher, but when he or she doesn't tell us what we want to hear, we leave and find another teacher who does tell us what we want to hear, right? Gurus are not there to tell you what you want to hear. They'll tell you what you need to hear. And sometimes that isn't a pleasant thing, for us to look at our own garbage, look at our own stuff. In short, we don't know how to be a good friend to our friends or a good student to those who kindly teach us the Dharma. And again, we don't even know how to go about having a good concerted effort at our practice by attending to each subject and each thing that we study with full importance of that topic. Okay. There's a little phrase that comes out of Atisha's Bodhisattva's Jewel Garland. I may have taught this for Usul Shenpenling. I don't recall. It's a wonderful little text with, I don't know, about 26, 27 verses in it or something. And in that verse, it says, be free of flattery and fickleness in friendship. Be steadfast and reliable at all times. Do not disparage others, but always abide with respectful demeanor. It's a wonderful short little text that is all these kind of, some of them are like Miss Manners advice and things like that, but they're really very precious because, again, this is Lama Atisha, who is the person, the Indian master who brought these teachings to Tibet and brought Dharma Rakshita's text and the whole Lojong tradition that we are learning in this course. So this was one of his texts that goes into these sort of short verses of how to practice as a bodhisattva. Very, very nice text. This is actually the version that I believe is in the Mind Training collection that Thupten Jinpa translated. I think it's in both the essential one and the large one. Let's go on to verse 43 now. I think this is, whenever we are cheated by others' deception, it is the sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us as retribution for our great pride and strong desirous hunger. This one too might look like, what's the connection here? Talk about that in a moment. Now we should diminish desire with respect to all. What's going on in this verse is that you're being the person cheated by others deceiving you. So if you feel like maybe somebody did get some money out of you and hightailed it out of town and you never saw them again, they ripped you off or whatever, they deceived you. That's retribution for your having followed your own great pride and your own strong desire that led you perhaps and probably to do the same to others. So there's kind of a missing step here that would be inferred that, it's not just the pride and the strong desire that are causing this. It's when our pride and desire have led to us to take advantage of other people. And then we are the ones that are being taken advantage of. So we need to diminish our desire with respect to all, not be kind of crazed with our desire, following it like junkies. Like Venerable Rabina says, we're like junkies born into a land of junk. So not follow that mind in that way. So in the first line of that, deception, this word deception, whenever we're cheated by others, deception is deceitfulness. There's a note on it, but it's just the Tibetan of that to give an idea of the words in Tibetan. Moreover, whenever by means of such deceitfulness we are deceived by others, reflect upon it, thinking, in previous rebirths, I developed very strong pride, thinking, for instance, these are weird phrases, I am the master of the house, a stick is a spear. A stick isn't a spear. If you're like, you think so much of yourself that you think you can say whatever and it's true, or that, you're not subject to other things. Maybe this is a particular person in the world, in the United States right now, that we can think of who says a lot of things that are not necessarily true, but are doing that out of their own pride, thinking that whatever they say is true. This is the bad actions turning against me of acting out of pride and strong desirous hunger, like those who are able to take others' wealth without satiation and are known in the world as hungry, desirous ones. So again, it's that pattern that we have when out of our own pride, and our own desire, that is like a desirous hunger, we take advantage of others, we take their wealth and never are satisfied. Kind of like people who are grifters, who just like take advantage of other people's vulnerabilities and do it out of a strong sense of superiority. Again, we see it in the world, we have to look at it in ourselves, not always be looking outside, but putting the mirror to ourselves. Maybe we've done this at times. Maybe we have taken advantage of others. Then meditate on taking and giving, Geshe-la says, and then from now on, we should have little desire for and actually be satisfied with respect to whatever perfections of psychic existence there are. I mean, this is one of the tools for kind of alleviating a lot of our desire is what we might call contentment or some level of satisfaction. Again, one of the faults of samsara is that you're never really satisfied, right? Because if you have that mind of craving, you just keep wanting more or something different or whatever, and you just keep looking. And even when you get something, it loses its luster. It's not as shiny as it was when you first got it, and you want something better, something new. And this is what our whole culture feeds off of, right? I think we talked about this before, this desire that is part of advertising, right? Introducing, I think it's the iPhone 15 now or something. I don't know what they're at. I mean, do they really need 15 of these? I mean, has anybody bought all 15? Probably. There have been a lot of people who bought all 15 who were happy to just get a new device and have the excitement of something new. And then they can't get kind of tired of it and they're waiting for the 16 and the 17 and on and so on. Well, this is the sort of mind that is propelling those sorts of actions where we are motivated by our desire to get whatever we want and we're never really satisfied. So I wanted to share a few slides around this idea of contentment and satisfaction, as well as I think there may be something else here. Yeah. Dissatisfaction is a great evil, Geshe-Sopa says. It is best to be fully satisfied with whatever one has. As Nagarjuna taught his friend King Gautami Putra in the letter to a friend, many of you know this text, it's a short text by Nagarjuna, where he was writing advice to this king who was a friend of his about how to live one's life. And this is the way that Geshe-Sopa abbreviated this: satisfaction is the most excellent of all riches. Here's another version of the verse that comes from, it's verse 34 of Nagarjuna's text. He says, of all great wealth, contentment is supreme. Said he who taught and guided gods and men, in other words, said the Buddha. The Buddha says, of all the wealth there is, contentment is the best wealth to have. So always be content, Nagarjuna says. If you know this, yet have no physical wealth, true riches you'll have found. You actually have true riches if you have contentment, rather than all the physical things, material stuff, that doesn't really bring about contentment. And it's also something that no one can take away from you, right? Everyone can steal all your physical wealth. They can come in and rob you blind and come back home and there's not even a piece of cloth that, left in your whole house. Everything's gone. But they won't have taken your contentment if you were living with contentment in spite of whatever you had, right? So Geshe-Sopa continues. He says, even if you are a king dwelling amid gold and silver, such as this king that Nagarjuna wrote to was, if you are not satisfied, if you're not content with what you have, you are mentally poor. But if a beggar sitting on a filthy cloth with only enough poor food to fill his or her stomach for a day is satisfied, then they're much wealthier than the king, right? It's the real riches that we want to develop, of a sense of contentment or satisfaction, a lack of desire, so that we're not continually driven by that and thereby engaging in behavior that causes others to deceive us and take things from us and, rip us off or whatever. Okay, verse 44. Whenever our own listening and explanations are accompanied by attachment or hatred, this is again, whether we are listening to the Dharma or explaining the Dharma to others. So we're talking, here about both activities, being on the receiving end of Dharma or the sending end of Dharma. Because even though we might not consider ourselves to be teachers where we're giving explanations, we might actually talk to other people about the Dharma. But if we're doing that with attachment or hatred, it's the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having sincerely reflected upon the faults of the maras, the demons. And we'll look at kind of what that all means. I'll introduce you to what are traditionally called the four maras, but we're really specifically talking about the maras of the afflictions, and more specifically self-cherishing, because again, when it is together with these afflicted states of mind, it's the major problem that we initially have to confront. So now Dharma-Rakshita says we should examine adverse conditions and abandon them. Do whatever we can to abandon the adverse condition of the self-cherishing mind in particular. So let me introduce you to what are called the four Maras. You may have heard teachings on these before. This is what are traditionally presented, though you could say this word Mara or demon can apply to an infinite number of things. But these are kind of the four categories that things tend to fall into. The Mara of the aggregates, you know this term probably, aggregates. Aggregate is referring to a collection or a heap of something. And we tend to have mental aggregates and physical aggregates. Those are the two main categories we could put into, though the Buddha delineated 5 aggregates where he divides the mental aggregates into 4 rather than just lumping them together as mental aggregates. But this is kind of the collection of the stuff that we have with us, our body and mind, that is kind of a demon in and of itself, because as long as we're tending to some sort of embodied existence, we're going to have problems, difficulties, including the second one, which is the Mara of the Lord of Death, which is the fact that when we get a body, such as this physical human body that we possess currently, we are subject to death. This isn't an actual being, though it is personified again as Yama. We saw that way back at the beginning when we had that praise to Yamantaka. Yamantaka is the destroyer of Yama, death. But nonetheless, we're all subject to death, right? We have to leave this life eventually. And then the Mara of the afflictions. This is the main one that we're talking about here, and specifically the afflicted states that arise with self-cherishing. This is the demon that we have in our minds frequently. And if it's not present in our minds, it's always there in a dormant state, waiting to arise with the proper conditions. And then we have what are called the Mara of the sons of the gods, the Devaputras. The sons of the gods, these are kind of, it's kind of a weird description. Here, I'll read you what Geshe Jampa Gyatso said in his commentary when we studied this in the master's program. He says this is specifically referring to what in Tibetan is called Garab Wangchuk, who is also known by the name the one who possesses 5 arrows, and is called the one without a body in some Hindu scriptures. This is the only one that is an actual being of these 4 Maras. So when we think about these demons, we might think it's something outside of ourselves. Most of the demons are within our own continuum. They're our own crazy afflictions, our own being subject to death, our own being under the control of these aggregates to some degree in this embodied existence. He says one of the arrows of the son of the gods is said to make people intoxicated. One makes people faint, one makes people confused, one paralyzes people, and one makes people proud. Maybe we can see again that if you have a karma with a particular being, then maybe they become an instigator for you to have that arise in you. And that's maybe how these son of the gods appear or manifest. But you have to have a karma with these beings to be influenced by them. But it's sort of, I envision it to be sort of like Cupid, right? That when we have St. Valentine's Day, where they're shooting the arrow and causes you to get all a flitter when you see somebody that you find attractive or whatever. That's like to make people, kind of intoxicated or whatever. So he said, then when one is struck by the arrow that confuses, one wakes up in the morning already dull and heavy. When struck by the arrow that paralyzes, one becomes rigid. When struck by the arrow that makes one faint, of course one faints. When struck by the arrow that makes one proud, you have pride. This is a Mara, because when we are proud, we are obstructed to gain knowledge, and this harms us. These arrows can also be called the arrow of attachment, the arrow of hatred, the arrow of ignorance, the arrow of jealousy, and the arrow of pride. These correspond with the previous 5 that were mentioned. So again, we can correlate them to afflictions. But that's just another way that we can think of a Mara as being an actual being that we've developed some karma with in a previous life that then entices us into the arisal of that delusion on the basis of whatever that relationship was previously, the karma that you had with that being. So again, let's look at what Geshe-la says about this, because again, the main Mara that we're really talking about is the Mara of self-cherishing, which is when this is an afflicted state of this mind arising that cherishes ourself. When attachment and hatred are illustrated with respect to explaining and listening to the Dharma, for instance, it is as follows. Whenever, while listening and explaining, we are accompanied by attachment or hatred without applying their antidotes, such as that even at the time of explaining or listening, we are motivated by the attachment, hatred, or competitiveness that thinks, for instance, oh, since even he is explaining the Dharma, I too will explain the Dharma. It's kind of like having a pride in our mind that thinks just on the basis of like hearing Rinpoche teach or something, or His Holiness teach that, oh, what they're doing, they can do that. I can do that. You know, maybe not. I think we have to check and see, do we really have what it takes, to teach in the manner that so many of these great masters are able to teach. Um, so again, this is where we have some sort of delusion, some pride, attachment to our view of ourselves that causes us to have those sorts of thoughts. So when that arises, when you have like distorted thinking, when you're listening to the Dharma, or even if you're explaining it to others, thinking pridefully about yourself and attachment to your own knowledge and whatever, in this life and previous rebirths, I did not think sincerely about the faults of the Maras that are explained in many texts, such as the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra and 8,000 verses and so forth. In particular, the worst Mara in this context, as was explained before, is self-cherishing. Therefore, through excellently examining the faults of these Maras in general, and in particular, the faults of self-cherishing, which is the main adverse condition, I will strive to abandon them. Then we should meditate on taking and giving. And from now on, we think through examining the faults of self-cherishing, the main adverse condition, we should abandon it. So again, self-cherishing is the main thing, the main target that we need to abandon as part of these teachings. And especially if we are to keep from having those sorts of experiences in our Dharma study, listening to the teachings, as well as in our teaching to others. Now we have a verse that's kind of about, us having ingratitude and that manifesting karmically in terms of bad results from whatever we try to achieve, both mundane and super mundane, or maybe not super mundane yet, but, certainly activities that are more spiritual. Dharmarakshita says, whenever all the good we do turns bad, it is the sharp weapon of bad actions turning against us. Why? For having failed to repay all the kindness we received. Now we should accept great kindness with reverence and do what we can to repay that kindness, is kind of a way of making good on recognizing the kindness that we receive from others. Ingratitude is a really kind of horrible mind because it doesn't respect the fact that we do receive so much of what we benefit from other beings. So let's look at what Geshe-la says here. He says, motivated by a benevolent attitude toward others, however much good we do, all of it turns bad. Even though we've got like this good attitude in what we're doing, our good acts don't come to fruition. It turns bad. For example, when even the abbot of a monastery and others give advice and scold the assembly of monks out of affection for them, but they resentfully say, he said this and that to me, and there's backstabbing and so forth. This is a good deed turned bad, right? So if you were this abbot and you're like trying to get the monks and nuns or whatever, if you'd be abbotess then, but anyway, you're trying to get them in shape and do what they need to do, and all they do is say bad things about you and what have you, do backstabbing to you and what have you. That's a good deed turned bad. That's something you were meaning well and had a good benevolent attitude, but the results weren't good. When this happens, Geshe-la says, think, this is due to failing to repay others for the kindness I received in the past. Moreover, this refers not just to my parents, but also to all the people who benefited me out of affection. We often talk about the kindness of the mother and the father for that matter, but our mothers are particularly important in terms of the years of development that we have where we rely upon them. We looked at this when we went through the technique of the 7-point cause and effect method, where we think of all beings in that role. So it's not just recollecting the kindness that our parents gave us, but all the people who benefited me out of affection. And to not only them, but also the sentient beings who simply have the kindness of my mother. In other words, they may not be directly kind to me in this life, but they were my mother in another life. This then is the bad actions turning against me, of failing to repay all their kindness by inflicting harm on them instead, and so forth, motivated by the thought cherishing myself. So instead of, repaying the kindness of others, we've often been involved in harming them, and not good. We meditate on taking and giving. Again, others are experiencing similar futility in terms of the good deeds we're trying to accomplish that go bad. From now on, we should respectfully venerate, without the slightest disrespect, wrong view, and so forth, those who are motivated by a benevolent attitude and affection for us. That is, those who possess the kindness of benefiting us in accordance with the Dharma, whether they are gentle or rough. To try to see everything as a kindness. I've given teachings on this numerous times, and no doubt to all of you up there. But we can see the kindness of all beings if we start redefining what we mean by kindness. Normally, we think of kindness as somebody doing something sweet and wonderful, delightful for us, right? Our friends show us that kind of kindness, and occasionally strangers do as well. Somebody might be really nice to us at the store and do something that we weren't expecting. We like, oh, that's so kind of them. But we can see kindness simply in terms of whether we can benefit from whatever it is that is going on. That way, you can look at the kindness of all the strangers. During the pandemic, we had countless people involved in helping to sustain our lives, that we're continuing to grow the food and harvest the food and ship the food and package the food and whatever, all the various things that we're responsible or a part of getting the food on your table. Your sustenance was dependent upon countless strangers. That's a kindness. Whether they had any direct connection with you or not, that doesn't matter. As they were harvesting the vegetables, they weren't thinking, oh, I can't wait till, Ruth enjoys this eggplant, and I can't wait till Marilyn enjoys the zucchini and whatever. They weren't thinking in those ways, but we benefited from them nonetheless, right? Those fruits, vegetables, everything that is a part of creating a meal for us, just a simple meal, one little meal. We've got countless beings involved in creating that for us. And then, of course, we can even see the kindness of those who are difficult. That's what we're learning about in these teachings, too, right? That when people are manifesting in really malevolent ways towards us, that can actually be seen as benevolence. We can actually see it as a kindness to us, because that's our karma ripening into that appearance of somebody inflicting pain or suffering on us. And we can see the opportunity to change our minds at that time. What a gift they are. Again, as I pointed out just a while ago, bodhisattvas, they long for those kinds of beings to be in their lives. They look forward to them being there. You probably recall the story of Atisha. When Atisha went to Tibet, it said that he was worried that there weren't going to be any annoying people in Tibet. He had this vision of them being a very peaceful people that wouldn't be pushing his buttons. So he traveled with this Bengali tea boy. And this was somebody who apparently pressed the buttons quite well for Atisha. And so he actually brought somebody with him who would just naturally, by way of his demeanor or whatever, annoy the heck out of Atisha. And so he brought somebody to practice patience with. And the story goes that once he got to Tibet, he realized that he didn't need to bring the Bengali tea boy because they weren't as peaceful as what he thought they'd be. And they were pushing his buttons as well. But, we need those people in our lives. I hate to say it, but without those people, we can't develop, for example, the perfection of patience. You cannot get to a place where your mind is going to be undisturbed in the midst of whatever's going on without being annoyed and agitated and poked and prodded and harmed by these beings. As hard as it is to welcome that in, we have to get to a place where that's the final result. Let's carry on with a little bit more commentary from the slides. I think I have a few things to share here. That again is verse 45 that we're working with. This is an interesting little advice from Venerable Chodron. She says, in Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, one meditation to help us cultivate bodhicitta involves considering our relationships with different people. On this list, I don't know if this is comprehensive, but she says, for example, your parents, your teacher, older and younger siblings, managers, colleagues, employees, children, like by actually taking individual groups of people and thinking about them, and consider the relationships in terms of each of them. We contemplate how they have helped us. What is our responsibility toward them and how we treated them, to kind of be honest with ourselves, and they may have helped us in quite profound ways. Have we treated them as well as is called upon? Again, we don't necessarily do this meditation in this way in Tibetan Buddhism, but she says this meditation is very humbling because we often discover that others have benefited us, but we have responded in inappropriate, ungrateful, or even perhaps negligent ways. We have accepted their affection, care, and kindness without any thought of helping them in return. We've been kind of blind to our end of the equation. They've been dumping all this stuff on us that's so wonderful that we benefited from. And what have we done in turn? Now, again, recall that I was mentioning that that formula that we'd been using for all of these verses up to this point, that went through verse 45. And the last three in this section, because this is still in the one main section that we're working with on conventional bodhicitta, these are more summary in nature. And they're in a slightly different format. They give general advice on our practice, okay? So let's go to 46. This may be all we have time for tonight, but that's okay. In short, the undesirable that is encountered, and again, that's everything we've been looking at, that first line of every one of these verses. The undesirable that is encountered is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us, like a smith slain by his own sword, a swordsmith who has forged a sword that in the end comes back around and he's killed by that sword. Like he forges it for somebody who's going to be on the battlefield, but then he ends up on the battlefield and someone kills him with his own sword. That's the idea behind that analogy. Now we should be conscientious in regard to negative actions. And look at this conscientiousness. This is a very important mental factor. Let's actually go ahead and do that now. First, a little bit from Venerable Chodron. She says, now we practice being heedful of non-virtuous acts. That's the word she uses around being conscientiousness, heedfulness. This means we cultivate conscientiousness, an attitude that cherishes virtue and guards the mind from defilements. You might recall that we looked at this these two previously that are also important for us to use. One is self-respect. In the text, it was called shame. And then we had consideration for others, which was in the text called embarrassment. But again, these are factors that are a little more specific because at that time when we're tempted to do something that is going to bring about this sort of suffering result, it's negative karma we're about to create. If we have self-respect, then we think, this isn't living up to the ideals that I intend for myself to live up to. And therefore, I'm going to refrain from that action. But we can also have the consideration for others where we think that others are going to be negatively impacted if we do those particular actions or engage in that karma. Those are a little more specific. Conscientiousness is a general way that we go about kind of making sure that we keep moving in a virtuous direction, moving away from non-virtue. And we're going to see a definition being given of this, and then we'll go to Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary on this. Conscientious, this is from Geshe Rabtin's text, which is one that I refer to frequently when I teach on minds and mental factors, which is part of the basic program as well. It's a wonderful course to get you really familiar with as Venerable Rabina says, all the crazy roommates that you have in your mind. Some of them aren't as crazy. This is a virtuous roommate. This is one that we want to keep around and have present all the time. Conscientiousness is a distinct mental factor that cherishes the accumulation of what is wholesome and guards the mind against that which gives rise to afflictions. So it kind of keeps us in a very wholesome direction, keeps us attentive to the state of mind that I was talking about earlier, where we want to be able to confront and avert these afflictions, because we've got this impulse all the time to stay in a virtuous flavor, not to allow non-virtue to arise. Conscientiousness protects us from reacting in a negative way towards external conditions, and thus prevents the mind from being overwhelmed by attachment, hatred, and so forth. So this is one way of parsing up the mind at the time when virtue is there and saying there is an element that is going to keep us from moving in the negative direction. It's going to be kind of a protector, a force that can be manifest in a way that doesn't allow for the non-virtuous states of mind to occur. In guarding the mind, it is similar in some ways to self-respect and consideration for others that I just talked about, except that it is not based on a particular reason. Rather, it's a more fundamental protective quality. It's just that impulse, that desire to engage in virtue. And then we will complement it with self-respect and consideration for others as we need to allow us to overcome particular patterns of behavior, negative behavior, particular mindsets, afflictions, what have you. So then Venerable Chodron, in her talking about conscientiousness, she gives an example of how to work with it. She says, to do this, recall a time in your life when you cherished noble aspirations and virtuous intentions, and recall how happy you felt then. And notice that your mind was free from afflictions at that time. That was a good feeling, right? How happy you were that you were able to kind of be in a state that was virtuous, that was, where you need to be, where you want to be. The attitude that cherishes virtue prevents ignorance, anger, and attachment from arising. And if they do start to arise, we immediately recognize this and direct our attention back to our positive intention. Okay. Conscientiousness, she says, is the root of all the paths and grounds leading to awakening. One condition of our precious human life is having interest in the Dharma. And we are interested in the Dharma because we are conscientious. We cherish virtue, right? Acknowledge this of yourself. You've got some level of conscientiousness because you're here on a Tuesday night listening to these teachings, right? You have some desire to practice virtue. You see the goodness of virtue, the wholesomeness of it, the way that it complements who you are and your being fully your full potential, and what are the words to use. And this is what we have as our kind of fundamental core, is this goodness, this well-being that we want to listen to and embrace. Okay, good enough for that, but let's do Geshe-la's commentary quick before we do the discussion, just so you have that. I don't think it's very long on this one. He says, having indicated by means of the above verses, again from 10 through 44 or 45, the majority of actions that occurred in the past, now this verse indicates the way in which the undesirable arises due to conditions that expand in this life. Therefore, with respect to this, encountering suffering in this life, what is desired not occurring, the undesirable occurring, and so on, is simply the sharp weapons turning against us of bad actions done and accumulated in previous rebirths, like a smith slain by the very sword that he so excellently forged. Since it is impossible for the result of bad actions done by others to ever ripen upon us, think that such is the result of our own bad actions, and meditate on taking and giving. From now on, we should be conscientious in all ways, without ever engaging in negative, non-virtuous actions. So again, this is a summary verse, and the next one is going to be very similar. And we'll go through that next one at the beginning of next week and kind of review this one a little bit. But we're getting to, again, the very tail end of the advice that Dharma Rakshita is giving us in regard to all of this pertaining to karma ripening in this format of the Wheel of Sharp Weapons. Then we go into another section. So again, what you have for tonight in terms of the discussion is to work with the third question from homework 5, commenting on verse 39, because we didn't get to that last week. And then we actually made it through all of these for tonight, verse 46, 44, 41. So you've got plenty to work with in terms of the discussion. And I heard my mom come in, but I was in the middle of tucking and it felt like I'd lose my thread if I turned around to address her, but I need to go make sure she's gotten to bed. So I'll come back in and be listening. So anyway, I'll see you in a minute. Bill, you're going to do the leading again? Yeah, great. Okay, thank you all. And then if there are questions, hold on to them and I'll give a chance for answering those at the end of tonight. All right? Okay, thanks.
Hi, everyone. Look at you all. Yep, I will. I'll remind us. So, the first verse that we can chat about is verse 39. And this is, whenever, whatever we do, attachment and hatred arise in us. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for having hardened our intractable and negative continuum. Now we should rid ourselves completely of this rigidity. Um, I have both translations here. So, did this one speak to anybody? Ring any bells for you guys? This verse says that up until now we've held on to the improper outlook, stubbornly cherishing only ourselves. I'm trying to think of something to add. This verse says that no matter how much we try to suppress them when anger and attachment disturb and upset us, I kind of like that better. This kind of reminds me of how when I first started trying to do the wheel of sharp weapons practice while driving, it didn't seem to matter or work at all. um, but yeah, now I feel like it's working a little better. Well, I can go on to the next one if this one doesn't seem to. The next one's 41. Hang on a second. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Whenever whatever virtuous practices we do, our continuum remains unsubdued. It is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. For having given priority to the grandeur of this life, now we should concentrate on the desire for liberation. I think everybody experiences a little bit of this when they first come to Dharma practice. I kind of found that to be true for me. And I wonder if, I don't know, I'd be interested in asking Don if this is something that comes up. Because most people don't do a lot of virtuous practices before they get into spiritual practice, right? So usually the first couple times I feel like there's some obstacles. You want to talk, you can talk, they can hear you.
I just thought all of these verses tonight really resonated strongly with me. Like, I feel like a lot of times I practice, I don't get a lot of the same results I hear the people getting, the moments of bliss and blah, blah, blah. Nope, never experienced that. So I feel like it's really like all these verses really spoke to me. I'm like, oh, okay, this is why, this is why, this is what I need to work on. This is what I need to focus on. All right.
Anybody else? Just bring up anything from your own practice, maybe a particular experience you had with a particular practice. Kind of remember when I first started doing prostrations to the 35 Buddhas, I had all kinds of problems. Doesn't seem like folks are too jazzed. I got my shots today, so I'm not super awesome right now. But our next one is 44, which is this is right along the lines Colleen and I have been talking about. Whenever our own listening and explanations are accompanied by attachment or hatred, it is sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having sincerely reflected upon the faults of the Maras. Now we should examine adverse conditions and abandon them. And this one says, when the force of attraction or that of repulsion colors whatever we hear or we say, this is the wheel of sharp weapons. Till now, we have ignored what has caused all our troubles, the mass of delusion that dwells in our heart. Hereafter, let's try to abandon all hindrances, note their arisal, and examine them well. I think this one's hard. Definitely, you can feel these things arising, and I think it's a little easier with these kind of teachings, but in teachings when you're sitting there surrounded by tons and tons of people, it can be hard. Yeah, Ruth, go ahead.
When Don talked about the four Maras, I didn't really understand how number 3 and number 4 differed. Number 3 was the Mara of afflictions.
Mm-hmm. And what's the fourth one again?
Well, they called it the sons of the gods. I'm not sure I'm not quite sure I got it, but he talked about the sons of the gods were like the intoxication, the fainting, the paralysis, the pride, the confusion, which kind of seemed to me like afflictions. Some, I don't know. Anyway, it was kind of, I didn't really catch that.
Get the distinction between the delusions and those.
Yeah.
I think those all seem to be related to like the pride of higher states. If that makes sense. Because these are, I think if you think in terms of Buddhist cosmology, that gods are not in fact, eternal beings.
Right. He said something about them being external and everything else is internal, but I don't know.
Yeah, maybe we can ask him about that one. I don't know the answer to that one.
I just heard the question.
Oh, here he is.
Yeah, no, the way that it's presented traditionally is that fourth one is an external force, which would be again this Devaputra, this son of a god, rather than a son of a gun, but a being who you have some sort of karma with that triggers through these arrows. I mean, these arrows, I don't know. I never really got a clear explanation from my teacher in Italy, but there is some sort of mental impulse that causes that delusion to arise really strong. I think we've had this situation sometimes with human beings we've run into, right? Where you meet somebody and it's like the hairs bristle at the back of your neck and you're like I don't know, like there's something triggered in you that causes some dislike to arise or something where they've not even really gotten to know this person. There's just some weird
I don't like
karma
that guy kind of thing.
Pardon?
Like you just know that you don't get along with, you're not going to get
Yeah,
along with someone kind of thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a situation. I went to visit one of my friends. This was shortly after I got out of college, and I went back to, he was living in Chicago, and he invited this one person to his apartment. And it just like, as soon as I met the person, it's like, I'm not going to get along with this person at all. But I mean, I don't know if it's quite the same thing. Because again, I agree with you, Ruth. It does cause an internal thing to arise, but it's like there's an external factor, which is this son of the gods, is Devaputra, that kind of shoots you with this arrow that causes you to have that manifesting then. So it's just a sort of malevolent force. I don't think it's necessarily these human beings we run into, though maybe they appear in that form. Maybe they, manifest in our world so that they can do this to us. I was never really clear about exactly how these guys operate, but again, I think for the sake of what we're discussing, it's mostly to focus on the afflictions, and primarily, once more, the self-cherishing mind that can arise with these afflictions and become problematic, and make us focus on our own welfare at those times, and then all these other states arise, and karma arises on the basis of that. So, but there was one thing I overheard too earlier that had to do with, was it 41, when you were talking about, Bill, about not having engaged in virtue prior to the path, and then the problems that we have.
Yeah. Just kind of one of those, I don't know. I mean, I feel like a lot of my friends who have started practicing Dharma have, especially early on, encountered quite a few obstacles. And I don't know, I've always kind of thought about that in that way. And Deanna always kind of told me, or at least she didn't always tell me, but she kind of alluded to this fact that, I mean, sometimes you have negative karma that you have to purify,
Mhm.
and that you're purifying it sometimes without even knowing you're purifying it.
Yeah,
That's kind of how she
yeah,
put it to me. Like I was like,
yeah,
I feel like I need to do more purification. And she's like, you've been purifying all along, but that's why these things keep happening to you. And I was like, oh, okay.
yeah.
So, and it helped me get through some tougher times when it seemed
Mhm.
like things were falling apart.
Yeah. Yeah, no, having that perspective that what's ripening could certainly be stuff that's come to the surface on the basis of our trying to turn our minds in a more positive direction. That it's, and that's where we can go back to this idea of the afflictions being like a Mara or like a demon, that kind of comes up and manifests at times, and we want to go in the opposite direction, right? We want to start moving in the path of virtue, and all that happens is we keep getting triggered by the stuff going on in our lives to have the same sorts of reactions to things. So we can see these things as similar patterns, where the afflictions tend to arise much more easily than virtue arises, because we're not acclimated to virtue, right? But when those problems and difficulties are coming up that are kind of trying to pull us in the direction of having those more habitual mindsets, that's the often evidence that we're going in the right direction. I think it goes back to the thing I shared with you a couple of sessions ago, where I mentioned that Venerable Robina said to me when I was getting ready for the master's program and said everything was going fine. She says, well, if everything's going that well, either you're a Buddha already or you're not practicing hard enough. The idea is that if you are practicing well, that doesn't mean that everything goes well. That's our deluded state of mind that thinks, oh, if I'm doing my meditation and I'm doing my purification, I'm doing this and I'm doing that, well, then I'm going to have smooth sailing. My days are going to go by like everything going the way I want them to. That's not how it works, folks. Actually, it's the opposite, that when we have a lot of crap on our plate, that we have to deal with, that can be a sign that you're bringing all the stuff up that needs to come up, that you need to deal with in a different way to create the patterns that you are trying to sustain and develop in your own mind. And that's hard because, again, we think it's the opposite. We think, oh, well, I can practice and then life will be a breeze. Eventually it is. I mean, the whole point of practice is to eventually get to a place where you do develop this deep inner happiness and well-being that is unchanging. And that's state of, liberation and enlightenment. That's that definite goodness that we often talk about, that's very certain to occur. And whatever's going on won't be of any bother at all. But while we're getting there, we do have to be dealing with the garbage that comes up, dealing with the stuff that is there just waiting to ripen, to rejoicing. That was, I think, the story I told you too about when I fell at the Light of the Path retreat. I had this huge gash over here. And Venerable Rabina, when she saw me, I think you recall, and she said, "Oh, congratulations." And that's not what I was thinking when I fell to my face on the asphalt, the day before or whatever. Right? We tend not to think in those ways. When we think things happen to us in a negative vein, that, don't think it's something to be rejoicing about, to be happy about, to congratulate ourselves about. But that's all coming to the forefront. That's coming up to the surface. That's the indication that we're actually moving in the right direction. So a charmed life is not a good sign necessarily. Anything else? Yeah, Ruth.
Yeah, you said something earlier, which I think was a good reminder to me, is that, before I started practicing or hearing the Dharma or even thinking about these things, I never noticed all these things. But now that it's a good sign that you're noticing these things. This is kind of way to paraphrase it. It's a good sign that you're noticing that, you get angry and you get jealous and you get, because when you notice it, then you can do something about it. And if you didn't even, I didn't even notice it before, right? It was just part of the background. So
yeah. Well, exactly. If we're going to change our minds, we have to be attentive and mindful and see what is occurring and then do something different. And so having that awareness is an important part of it. And just to congratulate ourselves when that starts to develop is important, because that's one of the key things that we need to be able to change our minds. That's where, there's a lot of this emphasis on mindfulness in our culture even. It's even gotten this nickname of McMindfulness because it's like McDonald's. It's like everywhere. There's mindfulness in all different professions and disciplines and what have you. And in and of itself, mindfulness doesn't have any sort of value, virtuous or non-virtuous. It's what you do with that mindfulness. Are you using that mindfulness to really investigate and see what's going on in your mind and become more aware of it so that you can nip it in the bud and do, eventually won't get that right away again? Or are you just using your mindfulness to simply be present with what's going on without making any effort to change? And you can use mindfulness in a variety of ways, or you can even use mindfulness in non-virtue. Venerable Rabina often points out how a good thief, you're talking about like a bank thief or an art thief or whatever, that's going in there in the middle of the night and having to be extremely aware of where all the triggers are that are going to, pull alarms and the cops show up and whatever. You have to be very mindful to be a good thief. That doesn't make mindfulness anything virtuous then at all necessarily. So what are you doing with your mindfulness? Rinpoche would often talk about this at the retreats, the Light of the Path retreats. Mindful of what? Mindfulness isn't just good enough on itself. Mindfulness of practicing virtue, of abandoning the afflictions, of even just being aware of what's going on in our mind. Those questions that Geshe Sopa had, that I had on the screen, that were from the Steps on the Path to Enlightenment, Islam Rim commentary. It's like, what's going on? What's about to arise? What's happening in my mind? We need that kind of introspective awareness. It's really examining and seeing the contents of our mind and being honest with ourselves, not just brushing it under the rug. Oh yeah, there's attachment, but no, I'm not going to deal with that today. No, we have to be on it. That's the job. Goes back to a lot of what we discussed tonight, that wonderful phrase from the Kadampa Geshe Ben Kongyo, standing at the door of the afflictions, holding the spear of the antidotes, just waiting, for them. How dare you come into my mind? And then we'll just pierce them. And it's kind of a militaristic example, but that's what we want to do. That's the enemy. The enemy is self-cherishing, is anger, is hatred, is attachment, is jealousy, all of these things. They're the real enemy. They're the ones that create the external enemy. You don't have an external enemy without those mindsets. So, one thing I might mention, I don't know if there were other questions, that verse that we were looking at that said about the faults of the Maras, I might point out to you that there's a wonderful little thing on the shortcomings of self-cherishing in the book called Bodhisattva Attitude. What I want to do here on this, that'll give a little bit more of the screen. Bodhisattva Attitude is a free publication of the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive. And again, I don't know that you can actually get the physical book still. You might not be able to, but you can download it. There's a whole chapter here called The Shortcomings of Cherishing the Self and the Advantages of Cherishing Others. And Rinpoche goes into extensive description about all the various things. Normally, we just kind of lump it together and we say, you know, well, self-cherishing causes all the suffering and problems, and cherishing others causes all the happiness. But how does it do that? Like here, it says in this first bullet point, well, it says it just above it, first consider how all your present problems are directly related to the self-cherishing thought. Think, for example, that it is because of self-cherishing that, first, I come into conflict, quarrel, and argue with others, and get upset when criticized or shown disrespect. Secondly, I suffer from stress, loneliness, and depression. Third, I experience the pain of anger when others don't do what I want or go against my wishes. Fourth, I experience the pain of attachment and rejection over and over again, and so on. It goes through all of this. This goes on for quite a few pages. Then the advantages of cherishing others, looking at all the things that are on the other side of it, right? You know, so those are really nice points to meditate on, to kind of, as that verse said, go back to verse 44, I think it was, where it says, whenever our own listening and explanations are accompanied by attachment or hatred, it is the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us for not having sincerely reflected upon the faults of the Maras. Now we should examine adverse conditions and abandon them. Really look at the mind of self-cherishing and see it for what it is. It's not your best friend, folks. It's not who you want to be hanging out with. You know, it is the enemy. It is part of the Maras, the afflictions, the demons that are plaguing us. So, any other questions or comments on tonight or in the practice in general? Or so again, I would encourage you to access that that material I just put up on the screen, again, through Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive, which is lamayeshe.com. And you can go right to that text again called Bodhisattva Attitude. And there's a whole chapter, again, dedicated to that reflection on those. It's really worth just taking a look at and seeing, because it is interesting to do that analysis. So how does a self-cherishing mind cause you to be lonely and depressed? That was one of them I just said, right? You know, what is that about? Where does that come from? How does self-cherishing do that? How does it ripen into these experiences or cause those sort of mind states to evolve? Anyway, have some fun with that. But otherwise, I would encourage you just to continue doing what we're doing. We're at, again, the tail end of this section. I'll put on the screen for just a second the let's see, yeah, it's in this one. The chart, yeah. So again, we are here still in this section. Remember, I did change these numbers. The first one was 1 to 8, and then this was verse 9 for the second, and then this was 10 through 48. The verse numbers from here on out are fine. I don't know why they weren't correct in that first part, and I should have somebody, you know, in the basic program office, you know, people who work with this from FPMT side change it, but we are about ready to enter into next week. We'll finish off this section on karmic cause and effect and their antidotes to do this kind of verse that moves us in another direction, recognizing the enemy of self-cherishing, like saying, this is the real problem now. We've got the evidence. We've lined up all the evidence. We presented it in court, and we know that the culprit is the self-cherishing mind that we now need to prosecute. So that's where we're going to move into a really long section from verse 50 through 90, where we're requesting Yamantaka to remove self-cherishing and self-grasping, but primarily it's the self-cherishing mind that gets worked on continuing in this section, because again, this whole first part is all about conventional bodhicitta, all about the force of loving kindness, compassion for others, cherishing them, that develops into bodhicitta, that mind that wishes to become a Buddha for their sake, and then is the immediate counter force to the mind of self-cherishing, self-centeredness. All right, that's where we're going. Okay. So if there aren't any other questions or comments, then let's go to the prayers for tonight and dedicate. That's right there. Okay. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And we make prayers for our teachers. Again, we recite the prayer for His Holiness, but with the intention that all those beings who are playing that role for us and others in this world right now, who are still with us, that they have good health, long lives, that all their wishes are fulfilled, so we can continue to experience the benefit of these beings in this world as long as possible. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then we make strong prayers for Rinpoche's return. Whether this has happened or not, it's still good to keep reciting this, to keep wanting to reunite with our precious Guru, Lama Zopa, the head of our organization, spiritual director of the FPMT, for many years after he and Lama Yeshe founded our organization. We depend upon these beings continuing to be in our lives, to continue to guide us, and to also guide all the other countless beings that they will have an influence on through their teachings and so on. So let's say this prayer with deep request from our own hearts to receive the benefits from Rinpoche's return, but also all beings to benefit from that. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shervakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And as we generally do, let's send this positive energy out to beings whose situation moves us at this time. And it could be beings that we don't know, such as what's happening in Gaza right now, Israel, all of the strife and war and fear and danger that is happening for beings just like us, human beings, other beings who are being affected by that situation, as well as in Ukraine, as well as so many other parts of the world where they're experiencing other disasters, natural disasters, poverty, strife, but then also the beings that we know individually who are experiencing suffering at this time. We want to send this energy out to them in the same manner of giving in the Tonglen meditation. Give all the merit that you've accumulated away. Don't hold back any of it, and really want it to ripen for these beings in particular, as well as for all sentient beings, so they all can be free of suffering and find the path that leads to true peace and happiness. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to teach this text. I'm really enjoying going through it with all of you and appreciate the questions and things coming up. So again, do your best over the next week to practice as best as you can with these teachings. And I'll see you next Tuesday. I'll still be here from Mom's till I go back next Wednesday. So, all right, everyone, be well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Okay, bye-bye.